Hello, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's double feature presentation, Truth Be Told, our cross-country fiction tour. This afternoon continues our Words Across Canada series, and we're pleased to have collaborated on this event with our partner Word on the Street festivals in Lethbridge, Saskatoon, and Halifax. If you've been enjoying the Word on the Street's programming so far, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can hit the notification bell on YouTube so you never miss another live stream. I'm David Alexander, and I'm the Festival Director for the Word on the Street Toronto. The Word on the Street, or WOTS for short, is a festival of books, ideas, and imagination. But we're more than a festival. WOTS is a community. We asked, and you told us what matters most about the WOTS experience: discovery, inspiration, connection. Our community is creative and resilient, and we're excited to bring you the Word on the Street in your homes. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Word on the Street operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Takaranto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people with long histories on this land. We are privileged to live, work, and create in this territory and strive to act with awareness and solidarity. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you occupy, wherever you're tuning in from. Before I ask our host for this afternoon, Stephen Beattie, to join me on the stream, a few words about the next events in this series happening right here on the Word on the Street YouTube channel. Tomorrow night, in partnership with Diaspora Dialogues, we have a conversation with playwright Serena Parmar on her play The Orchard, an adaptation of Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, told through the lens of a Punjabi Sikh family in the Okanagan Valley. On Tuesday, we'll be celebrating the 2020 Trillium Book Award for Fiction in partnership with the Kingston Writers Fest. We're excited that Ali Hassan, host of Canada Reads, will interview finalists Zalika Reed-Benta, Martha Bailey, and Seth alongside the award winner Taya Matangi. Then on Friday, September 25th, best-selling memoirists Jessie Thistle and Helen Knott will speak with Tracy Lindbergh. And of course, don't forget to register for WOTS 2020, our first ever virtual festival of storytelling, ideas, and imagination, streaming live right here next weekend. You can find more details about these events on our website or Eventbrite, links in the banner below, or live in our YouTube comment section. And now we're going to bring on our host for this evening, review editor at Quill and Choir magazine in Toronto, Stephen Beattie. Stephen, before we start, I just want to let our audience know a little bit about today's format. We'll be starting shortly with our first pair of authors, Kevin Major and DK Stone. Then in about half an hour, you'll introduce our second pairing, Andrea Gunraj and Carol Rose GoldenEagle. Today's event's a bit of a snapshot of how programming next weekend will work, except we'll be running somehow 3 streams like this one, and it'll be all day long instead of an hour and a half. Lastly, if there are any audience questions for today's featured authors, we do have WOTS moderators watching in the YouTube stream for your questions. So all of that said, Stephen, thank you so much for being here today. Let's get started.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks to everyone at Word on the Street for having me this afternoon. It's great not to be with everybody as we continue with this pandemic adventure that I think is going on longer than most of us expected or ever wanted to. But we were saying earlier how cheering it is that the festivals like Word on the Street have been able to pivot online, because this is a really fabulous way to connect with authors and audiences, and I am delighted to be a part of it. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is a double header. We've got 2 sets of 2 authors, and we're going to begin with a couple of genre mystery authors, Kevin Major and Danika Stone. Each of those, as David said, is going to read for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A, and of course, audience questions are welcome. If you submit them, I'd be happy to field them as time permits. So to get started with the reading portion of the first half of our event this afternoon, I'd like to welcome Kevin Major, who is a Governor General Award winner and the author of 19 books, fiction, literary nonfiction, poetry, and plays. His book, As Near to Heaven by the Sea, A History of Newfoundland and Labrador, was a Canadian bestseller. And he lives in St. John's, but he's joining us today from Montreal to read from his newest novel, Two for the Tablelands. Please welcome Kevin Major.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to read, as Stephen said, from a new novel due to be in bookstores in about a month from now. And it's a follow-up to a first mystery novel of mine called One for the Rock. So it has the same central characters, different crime, different locale, still within Newfoundland. I like to think of these two books and any ones that might follow subsequently as crime fiction with a sense of humor. So the central character is a bit offbeat. His name is Sebastian Sinnard, and he and his teenage son have gone to a part of Newfoundland called Grossmore National Park, and there a place called the Tablelands, which is a world famous geological feature. And there they've discovered a body. Rural Newfoundland falls under the very watchful eye of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, no longer given much to horses, however. Constable Trottier, no pun intended, arrives on foot. Not the least bit out of breath, I will add. She looks lovely. With her, and obviously in charge, is Staff Sergeant Todd McAvery, cool and efficient, together with two staff from Parks Canada. Your name, please? The staff sergeant has a notebook out, pen in hand, while a dead body awaits. Sebastian Sinnard. Always a slight embarrassment. I spell it before he asks. My son's name is Nicholas. Your ages and place of residence. Good God. Nick decides to answer for himself before I had the chance to erupt. He answers McAvery's questions with an eagerness I would not have thought possible even 10 minutes before. No, he didn't see anyone other than his father, and no, he wasn't doing anything except walking around. And you stopped when you discovered what appeared to be a body under the rocks. Of course he stopped. He was traumatized. I tried to rein myself in. Sergeant McAvery, shouldn't we just proceed to the scene? He looks up from his notebook. It is important that we first establish a few facts, which I take means making sure we're not two bloody loonies with a bogus story that's taking up their valuable time. All this from a cop who probably cut his friggin' teeth on speeding tickets and salmon poaching. We do eventually make a move. Nick and I positioned between the RCMP and the Parks Canada duo, whose names by now have been revealed as Sandy and Jean-Claude. Sounds very outdoorsy, bilingual, park-like. We make our way down the incline, stopping at the bottom. I bring them all to a halt. Nick, I want you to stay here. Everyone else, you should prepare yourselves. It's not pretty. McAvery doesn't take easily to relinquishing command. As head of a crack 4-person police detachment in Rocky Harbour, Newfoundland, he is used to being in control. He speeds ahead, but comes up rather abruptly. I would say the squelched penis did the job. The others ease their way into a viewing position on either side of him. Jesus, intones McAvery. Precisely. I would feel even more vindicated that it wasn't all so macabre. Constable Trottier's uniform poise is lost. Her face stiffens, the grotesqueness tossing her off her game. Sandy covers her mouth with her hand. Tabernache, shit, mutters Jean-Claude. It's not a pretty sight, but nevertheless, any doubts that I might have been fraudulent in my claims of vile murder on the Tablelands have been emphatically dispelled. As disgusting as it is, attention turns to the slit throat. Oddly enough, there seems to be a little discharge of blood other than the thick spill around the immediate area of the neck and chest. No trail of red over the rocks leading to my observation that he must have been lying on the ground before his throat was sliced open. McAvery is not keen on me suggesting any such thing, inappropriate it would appear. Speculation in the case of criminal activity is the absolute purview of the police. He doesn't realize I'm a licensed private investigator. Yes, Staff Sergeant McAvery. There are other minds at work in the world of crime than those of the RCMP. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin Major. Our second reader today is Danika Stone, who discovered a passion for writing fiction while in the throes of her master's thesis. A self-declared bibliophile, Stone now writes novels for both teens, including Switchback, Internet Famous, and All the Feels, published by Macmillan, and adults, The Dark Divide, Edge of Wild, and Fall of Night, published by Stonehouse. She lives in Lethbridge, Alberta, and to read from Fall of Night, please welcome Danika Stone.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I've never been to Word on the Street Toronto before, although I've been to Word on the Street Lethbridge a few times. So thank you. It's awesome. So to set our scene, this is book 3. It's the last book in my Waterton trilogy. It's kind of interesting to be at that stage where I'm closing chapters. So a lot of things that are happening in book 3 were kind of hinted at in book 1 or 2, and it hits stores November 1st. So imagine yourself, you're standing on a porch. It's night. You have finally found where the young woman whose body was discovered was staying. She may have hidden, but the 2 police officers there have finally found where she was prior to her murder. And that's where we'll begin. Sadie's fingers tensed as she turned the key. The lock was stiff, and her hand slipped and slid beneath the latex gloves. Come on. The lock began to move, tumblers clicking before it froze again. Come on, almost there. She twisted harder. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the key shifted with an audible click. The heavy wooden door of the cabin swung inward. Looks like that was the right. Her throat caught on the sickening stench of rot. What the hell is that? Marie said. Smells like something died in there. A knowing look passed between Jordan and Sadie. Just stay outside, sir, she said. We'll let you know what we found once we've gone through the house. You sure? I want to help if... Stay where you are, Mr. Miles, Jordan said, holding up his hand. We've got this under control. Sadie cupped her hand to her mouth, shouting, Brian, we're going inside now. Murray's waiting here. Can you come round? His answer echoed from the side of the house. Got it. I'll be right there. Just finishing this up. Sadie turned back to Murray. Stay here, she said sharply. This is a crime scene. We can't contaminate evidence. But it smells like... We will be right back, Murray, Jordan said. Just relax. He swung the door closed, separating the 2 officers from the man waiting on the front step. Thanks, Sadie said. Murray's getting on my last nerve today. Don't know what's up with him, Jordan said. He seemed weird to you? A bit. But then, it's Murray, she smirked. Weird is relative. Fair enough, Jordan laughed, then gagged. Jesus, what is that? Only one way to find out. Sadie walked forward with slow, steady steps, her ears and eyes attuned to the smallest of details. The entranceway, though benign enough, was cluttered with coats and several pairs of shoes. At least 2 of them didn't seem to have a pair. Sadie carefully stepped around the scattered footwear, heading toward the inner rooms. She glanced up. The lights in the hallway were on. You didn't turn on the lights when you came in, did you? Sadie said. No, just walked in. You? Not me. She pulled out her notepad. I'll make a note. Lights in the hallway on when we came in. I'm going to document the entrance, Jordan said, lifting the camera to his eye. Tell me if you see something. Got it, Sadie said, walking forward. Shout if there's anything that needs to be tagged. Uh-huh, thanks. The flash of the camera began like a lightning storm, filling the hallway as Sadie headed away from Jordan. Nearing the end of the corridor, the light grew dim. The faint sound of a television rose. Sadie paused. The scent of death was stronger here, and it had the copper penny undertone of blood. The memory of Jim lying dead on Susan's kitchen floor flashed and disappeared in the darkness of her mind, making the skin on the back of her neck crawl. She took a shaky breath. Just a step at a time, she whispered. There's nothing here. It only felt like there was.
And we're going to move on to the discussion portion of our the first half of this event this afternoon. And I think an interesting place to start, Danika, is with your name, because we were talking before we came on publicly about the name DK Stone, and I asked if you prefer Danika or DK, and you said, well, you know, you were going to go with Danika for these books, this trilogy, but your publisher warned you against using the same name you used for your young adult books because you didn't want teenagers reading these.
Yes.
So my first question is, how different is it writing mysteries for adults versus writing for young adults, and how do you switch back and forth? Like, do you have to put yourself in a different mindset?
I think the story informs it. I think when you're writing, the characters are going to tell you what story needs to be told, and certainly you can age it up or age it down. But I've never actually found that. I found for myself anyway that it's just the story that tells me. I also teach, and so I know if I'm writing something that I would feel a little uneasy with students in my English 30 class reading, I would probably keep that for my adult thrillers rather than put that in YA.
Right. Right. But are there different muscles that you use as a writer, though? Are there different decisions that you have to make in terms of genres? Have you ever written in the mystery genre for young adults?
Yes. So Internet Famous is actually just a mystery. Like, you have an online troll who's trying to destroy your life. And so I did the design of what I wanted the plot to be prior to writing it. And that process was almost exactly the same as it would have been for any of my murder mysteries. But it's interesting, once I'm in the writing zone, it becomes very different. The way that I kind of think of it is your action goes much more quickly, for me at least, with YA. Whereas with my thrillers, it's more about creating the tension and then holding it tight so that they have to go to the next chapter. So it's different ways of pulling people forward. I have far less exposition in my YA books, and I would miss that if that was the only way I wrote. So it's really nice to jump into my thrillers where I have the time to really build these characters and you're trying to figure them out.
It's interesting that you talk about having the time to do that, because I found that Fall of Night was an authentic page turner. I mean, I read it in a day. It's it's very fast paced. It's very propulsive, as is too for the Tablelands and your first book, One for the Rock, in the mystery genre. What about you, Kevin? Do you find that there's a different sort of muscle in your brain that you use when you're writing mysteries as opposed to when you're writing quote unquote straight fiction or poetry or nonfiction?
Well, interestingly enough, I also started out as writing young adult novels. I have to say that goes back quite a number of years, so I haven't done it recently. I actually found, I think, writing this mystery, the thriller, crime fiction, almost a bit easier in a sense. I was closer in age to the protagonist to begin with, whereas I was writing a lot of the YA from the perspective of the young person self in the first person, and that that required a bit of setting your mind back and thinking seriously about how people viewed things from that age perspective.
Right.
I entered the field of writing crime fiction just to see if I can do it, at the encouragement of my wife, who said, "You've been writing historical novels for too long. You're all too much serious. Lighten up a bit and write a murder mystery." So I did that, and I was really actually quite surprised how well it unfolded in terms of writing time. And normally, I feel if I write a page a day, then that's kind of, I'm doing well. But I found in some cases in writing the murder mystery, I was writing 3 and 4 pages. So, not that it didn't go back and required a lot of editing, but it seemed to flow fairly quickly. Once I had established the central character and saw what he was about and the way he viewed the world. So yeah, I think it requires something very different. Certainly very different from writing historical fiction, which I've done a fair amount, because that requires just so much research as compared to what I was doing here.
I think you both kind of made inroads into answering this question, particularly you, Danika. But what comes first for you when you're writing a mystery? Is it plot or character?
I think it depends on the book. But I sort of have a weird process for developing my characters. I will never start writing unless I have them created. I do what I call my shoebox method. So I'll have a shoebox. I'll have this kind of idea of where the story is going to go. And I start dropping things into that box, sort of building this person. So it might be a little... for Louise from Fall of Night, it was a little Buddha that had been my father, so a little quartz Buddha. And then it might be like old keys from some car. And you know, like they become part of these elements of their life. And they might never show up in the book, but somehow I feel like over that month that I build them, that I get to know them. But having said that, occasionally I start writing, and I'm thinking about actually the very first book in this series. I started writing and I'm like, I know Louise, I've got all these things for her. And I put pen to paper and there was a different character there. And he was an angry New Yorker and didn't want to be in this stupid small town where you couldn't get any cell phone reception. And I was like, who are you? And why are you in my story? And he really became the main character of book one. And that wasn't planned.
Right. What about you, Kevin? Like, the mysteries, I assume, have to be very carefully plotted.
Yeah, I was certainly aware of that, and you know, you in writing them, you put out a trail of details that somehow all had to come together at the end and make sense. Thank God for a really good editor, I should add. So I think I started out with the character. You know, he's far from somebody who normally gets involved in crime to begin with. He's a tour guide to start out with the first book. So my idea was, this is also going to give me a chance to kind of showcase interesting parts of the place where I live, you know, the city of St. John's.
Right.
And he's going to be, as I said, a little bit offbeat. He's going to view things. He has his own personal life plays a pretty strong part in both books. So I will, at the beginning, in both cases, kind of outline the plot. I knew basically where the murder was going to take place in this case, and I kind of see an end point. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to reach that, and as with Danika, you never know who might pop up along the way, you know. Sebastian has a dog very similar to my own dog, and I thought, oh well, you know, he'll make an appearance, but actually he kind of plays an increasingly large part in the story, and it was kind of a lot of fun to do that. You know, I was having a lot of fun writing both books.
I'm going to deviate from standard practice here, because while we're talking about plot, I've got an interesting question from one of our audience members. This is from Shazia. And the question is, what are some strategies used to sustain the mystery and the questions in your novels, and how do you decide when to reveal information in your plots?
Well, you know, as I said, I have an overall view of what's taking place or what's going to take place. But only as I move along do things start to inject themselves into the plot. So I don't have a fully detailed plot. I think you have to be comfortable with the characters, and you have to have a fairly strong sense of where the story is going to start and maybe roughly where it will end. And as you move along, you know, keep some notes so that you're not veering off and something that happened 2 chapters before are you know, running counter to what you suddenly decided to do here. So you try to keep track, but even at that, you know, so for example, when I submitted two for the Tablelands to my editor, she said, well, you know, there's this little point here that doesn't really make sense considering what happens 100 pages down the road in the book. So tighten that up a bit and make some decisions so that things do follow through in a logical sense.
Right. How about you, Danika? I mean, your book is almost 400 pages long. How do you keep a reader invested, and how do you know when to detonate those plot twists in a book that long?
Well, I think part of it is you plan it out before. For myself, I always keep in mind that, in my opinion, mystery thriller readers are some of the smartest readers in the world, and they're going to be looking for every clue that's in there.
They're going to try to catch you out.
Exactly. So you have to put them in, but in a very subtle way. So I might actually lay out where my red herrings are, and I have to trust that they're there. And even though someone might have to take the book and flip all the way back and go, oh, I see where this came from, that gives them a sense of, like success if I can do that. One of my best moments was actually having my editor read it, and she sent a message back to me and said, I didn't even see that coming. And I mean, that's all she does. It's mystery. So if I can do that, and I can't do it all the time, but if I can, I've been successful. I also think what Kevin was saying about characters is absolutely true. And I think if you build a real enough character and you're able to get into flow, and I bet you Kevin could talk about this as well, that flow, you're channeling a part of your writing abilities that is almost beyond your planning abilities. So I'm thinking in the first of the trilogy, the person I thought who was going to be guilty ended up not being guilty. It was a different person. And as I reached that point, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is who it is. And then I looked back, and all those things that had appeared in there could just as easily have been someone else. And it worked beautifully. So somehow my mind knew where I was going long even before my logical, sensible planning mind did.
So you fooled yourself.
I did, apparently.
Well, Kevin, have you ever had that experience of a plot deviating from where you thought it was going to go and going off in a completely different direction?
Yeah, when I start out the book, I don't know actually who did the crime. It kind of will come to a head and unfold in what a hopefully logical sense. But and as was said, you look back at the maybe the earlier pages of the book and see hints that you hadn't really thought about. And again, I've had the same experience with an editor saying, that was really good foreshadowing, and your part. Okay, good.
It was. Shifting from plot to character, Kevin, you've embarked on a series character here. What was it like writing that second book for you, and how do you keep that character fresh for you?
Well, his personal life is pretty front and center through both books. He's been fairly recently divorced, and he has a teenage son who he spends part of his life with him, and he has to deal with that. With having written young adult novels, we know that there's a lot going on from those ages. And as it so happens, the man that his ex-wife has taken up with is an inspector in the police force. So he has to encounter him from time to time in relationship to the crime. So it's the characters, to my mind, you can't say they take on a life of their own. That's obvious. But they, in some ways, the way that the plot develops has its first basis in the character.
Right.
What he will discover because of his kind of way he goes about things, and his attitude towards the world, in a sense, plays an important part.
But how do you keep that fresh in subsequent books? Like, how do you prevent yourself from getting bored with this guy?
Well, I had the advantage, and I hopefully this will work, that his teenage son gets progressively older as the books move along. So he's having to deal with that. And also he's getting into personal relationships himself. So some that don't work out, some that will possibly work out, we'll have to wait and see. So I think the interest in subsequent books will be as much in, what's going to happen to Sebastian this time around.
Right.
Is he going to meet somebody and finally settle down a bit? And what's going to happen to his son, who is wondering what this relationship between his parents what will become of that. So I think there's an interest in the characters to begin with, and then it's also, to me, keeping it fresh. My idea is that I'm going to set a series within Newfoundland and Labrador, but in different locales.
Right.
So the first one is set in St. John's. The second one is largely on the west coast of Newfoundland in Rosemore National Park. And I've already have 100 pages written of a third, which is set in a different place again.
Right. Danika, you're in a bit of a different situation. Yours is not an ongoing series; it's a self-contained trilogy. But when you conceived of the trilogy, did you conceive of this giant cast of characters and you say, okay, this is going to be the protagonist of book one, this is going to be the protagonist of book two, and you've already admitted that those things change. How did you go about constructing the cast for all three of those books?
Well, the book was actually one long book. So it is now three separate books. But right. I remember when I signed with my now retired agent, Morty Mint, I remember he said he really got drawn into it. And then he called me and he said, all right, kid, like I can sell this much easier if you break it up. And I just was like, what? Because I had this intricate kind of connection between all these characters. But he was right. It is so much easier. So what I had to do is kind of separate the threads. Right. And Rich's story becomes book one. Louise's story is book two. Sadie's story is book three. They're still there. So you have them more as background characters in the other books, right. Which is kind of interesting. So Kevin talked about how the locale changes, but the characters are the same. And I just did the reverse. So the locale stays the same. The small town is the same, but we just kind of have the character. Here's this one that we'll focus on, and then this one, and then this. Right. And it really felt like it came together as a trilogy because that was as far as I had planned the book to go. And it did all the things I wanted to do.
We've talked about plot, we've talked about character, so we have to talk about setting. I'm interested in Waterton as a setting, this small town, Alberta town where everybody knows everybody else's secrets and everybody's gossiping, and there's this, this daily coffee klatch that they have at the local cafe where all of the townspeople get together and catch each other up on the goings on in the town. How true to life is that in terms of your own experience?
Okay, it's true enough to life. In fact, I wrote a letter to every person I knew in the town and said, this is fictional. I don't mean to insult anyone. But I knew that people would be trying to figure out who characters were. I knew that. And in fact, a lot of the locals who I'm close friends with had actually told me that was kind of a wintertime pastime when the first book came out. Like, oh, I know who this is. This is Danika's grandfather here. And yes, it was.
And were they right?
Some of them. Some of them are just fiction. And right. I know whenever you build a character, you take parts of people you know. But it's interesting, like my family has been in Waterton for 100 years. The cabin I have, 5 generations of my family have lived there. So I remember talking to my father, this is when I was young, and he'd say, well, those people aren't locals. And I'd say, why not? And he'd say, well, they came after 1940. That was kind of the mindset. You had to be there for the building of the big hotel before you were a real Waterton person. So I love that. And I know those people. I love them. I grew up with them. The local coffee meetings used to take place in my aunt's coffee shop. And I wanted to take this group that I loved and kind of show it from what would it be like to be an outsider, though, and not be accepted by these people. And I hope by the end of the trilogy, you just feel like you came home and you know all those locals and you know exactly who you'd go to talk to if you had to deal with something. I really had a great time writing them.
And Kevin, you've talked in the past, and you've talked here a little bit about the importance of Newfoundland to you. And it's almost as though you can take one from the rock, one for the rock and two for the Tablelands, and use them as the way you would use Dubliners or Ulysses with James Joyce, use them as sort of a guide for a walking tour to various parts of Newfoundland, because they're very specific in terms of the areas and the settings that you mention, and in terms of the way you describe them. Obviously, Newfoundland is very important to you. Do you consider these to be sort of a, I don't want to say a love letter to Newfoundland, but you know, you obviously get a great deal of inspiration from the land.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I've written a fair number of books, and most all of them are in one way or another connected to Newfoundland, including a pretty extensive history of Newfoundland. So I'm kind of well versed in our past and in our present. And I love this place, and I think that comes through in the books. You mentioned the term love letter. That comment has been made about One for the Rock. There's so many aspects to Newfoundland and settings in Newfoundland that would blend themselves really well to fiction. Newfoundland fiction is pretty well respected on the Canadian literary scene. There are a lot of good authors coming out of Newfoundland, and we have a lot to write about. History to begin with. Ours goes back further than any other place in the country. And characters, there is a Newfoundland character. Danika was mentioning her connection to Newfoundland, so I'm sure she would agree that Newfoundlanders have a special character, and so I want to make that part of what I do. It's entirely natural to me. It's not in any way do I think have second thoughts about it. I wanted to incorporate the setting as almost a character in a sense. And the first book is pretty well focused in St. John, so we see a lot of the city, we get a lot of the history. I try to do it in such a way, not to make it too in your face that this is a history lesson, but he is a tour guide, so it comes naturally to him to do that. And with the second book, again, we come back to St. John's each time because that's where he lives, but we're venturing off into a different part of Newfoundland with a different history and its own setting in a way. And so my idea, as I said when I started the book, if the first one worked out, and maybe if the second one works out, then I'm going to continue on setting them in different parts of the island and hopefully in Labrador. So this setting, as I said, becomes, in a sense, one of the defining characters of each book.
Now, having said that, this book differs from your first mystery because in the final third, you take Sebastian out of Newfoundland,
right,
and plop him down in Mexico.
Yeah.
What was the impetus for doing that? What was the impetus for making that move?
That's an interesting question, and the other connection is with Iceland and one of the characters. Both places I visited. I spent a few days in Iceland, really taken to it. And myself and my wife spent a month in San Miguel de Allende, which is where the character goes in this book. Why that happened, I'm not entirely sure. I know the murder victim ends up, as we discover, having been a foreign student at the university in St. John's who happened to come from Mexico. And so he's enticed in one way or another to make the trip down to Mexico because they think, of course, there's a connection to the crime in some way. So I'm not opposed to that. And in fact, as I think ahead, because Sebastian is also fascinated by Scotch.
Right.
Drinking of Scotch is an important part in both the books. So I think one day he's going to find himself venturing to Scotland. I think.
Are you going to take him to Islay so that he can visit the Lagavulin distillery? Danika, your book also moves out of Waterton a little bit. Now, I have to be very careful with both of these books, because you've got to watch out for spoilers, but it's not spoiling anything to mention that the book opens in New York, and it opens in New York on a very particular day. It opens on 9/11.
Yeah.
The prologue takes place on September 11th, 2001, which I thought was an incredibly gutsy move for a mainstream thriller. Why open with that?
There was a couple reasons. Based on the timeline, so book one takes place right at the end of 1999, and then book two takes place in 2000. Book three is happening in 2001. So to begin with, there's no way you can write a book about 2001 and not mention it. Right. But secondly, I've set up my character of Louise as she'll have these premonitions, but it's never clear. It's a dream. So the dream is, is it a dream that something bad is going to happen, or is it something where you can actually predict? And throughout the book, she never clearly has a handle on what it is throughout the whole series. So to start with this day, and you just say 6 months later, and then you just go into it, I think it lets your reader kind of put yourself into the shoes of someone who would just be there. It would be a beautiful day, and you would not expect it. So what would you do if someone calls you in a panic, get away from the buildings, move, I see things happening, and you're just saying, what's going on? And do you believe them? It establishes that it's real. And I know I've had really good reactions to the book, and I'm sure there will be some people that feel kind of shocked by that. I remember exactly where I was when it happened, and I was in the middle of Canada. I certainly wasn't there. But for Rich, as a New Yorker and as our main character, if he was back and he experienced that, it would change everything in his life, and it does. So I do think we need to recognize it as a moment that changed history. And so if I was writing 2001, there was no way I would not include that in some way. And it does kind of set off the whole issue with him getting back to Canada.
Right. You mentioned that one of your characters, Lou, has a sort of a variation on second sight, and there's another character, one of the police officers, Sadie, who also experiences something resembling a supernatural event or occurrence. What prompted you to include those elements in an otherwise straightforward naturalistic mystery?
Okay, so it's interesting. That was always part of the books. And this is where things from my own life have kind of come into play. I was, the last time I was camping with my father, we were drinking camp coffee, so the grounds are right in there. And he used to read tea leaves, but he was drinking his cup and then he put it down. And he became very, very kind of gray looking. And he said, something bad is going to happen. I see you kids standing around this hospital room. And then he tried to show me and it looked like nothing to me. And he was very upset. And he said, there's something, something's happened. Your mom can't go on this trip. And I said, well, why not? And he said, I see a plane in the Hudson River and people standing on the wing.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So mom canceled her trip. And nothing happened. No plane went down. A few years later, my dad was having his shoulder fixed. He'd slipped while shoveling. And I came in and he had a newspaper and he was showing me, and there was this photo that made me feel terrible. And it was a plane in the Hudson River and people standing on the wing. And my father died 24 hours later from having a reaction to medication. No one knew. He was supposed to go home the next day. But having something like that happen to you, I have no way of explaining it, but I just thought that would be an interesting thing to put in the book. Right. And so it just kind of became part of it. For Sadie, I had no intention of her to have this kind of thing where she hears the ghost. Had no intention at all, but it was one of those characters that just showed up. And I'm sure part of it was my brother had passed away just at the time I was writing the book. And he'd been on the organ transplant list, and we were so hopeful. He was right at the top, but sometimes you just don't make it. Yeah. And when I was writing, this ghost appeared, and I was very much writing what Sadie would be. I don't believe in ghosts. This is crazy. It's adrenaline. I'm under stress. I'm going crazy. And that's really, when we hear Sadie, that's how I was feeling writing this, with this ghost showing up and saying, well, you don't believe in us, but we believe in you, you know, kind of. So it felt right for the series. But yeah, it was based on some kind of strange little occurrences in my life and some of the stories my dad told me. And it just felt like Waterton's a unique place. And it is really on its own. It's got a very different character, and it's I could easily see that fitting.
Right. It's interesting. One thing that both of your novels have in common is they both have a murder in which a character gets his or her throat cut. And Kevin, you read a bit from the beginning of the book, which describes the murder scene. Not, you know, there are a couple of descriptions of the murder scene, fairly graphic in terms of what you have included in both the first and the second book. What is your approach to depictions of that kind of violence in mysteries and in fiction?
I'm graphic, but I think only to a certain extent. I want to depict the horrors of the situation, the dead body, in this case, almost fully covered by rock, loose rock. And I want to give the reader the sense of that, but I don't want to dwell on it too much. You know, I don't want to keep repeating this particular scenario and focusing again and again on this particular aspect of the crime. So it's there, it's referred to a couple of times, and that's, you know, it's kind of an ongoing mystery as to why the throat was cut. And so we had to come back to it, but we don't come back to it graphically again and again.
Right.
Yeah.
What about you, Danika? I mean, murder mysteries by definition imply violence. So what is your approach to those scenes in the books?
For me, I want to keep the tension high. So I spend a lot more time in the lead up to it of how do you feel going into the house knowing you can smell something. I spend far more time on that than the body. Now, obviously, there's going to be a body and we've got to know what it is. Sometimes I need that kind of shock to let the readers know, like, this is a real person that we're seeing here, even though obviously it's a fictional person, but to actually have that feeling of we're horrified. We need to reach that point. So you really desperately want to figure out who the killer is so it can be stopped.
Right. We're rapidly running out of time. So Danika, now that you've finished this trilogy, what do you figure is next? Are you going to return to Waterton?
I will never say no, because I just honestly, I don't know. I have 2 books that my now agent, Mo, has out and on submission, 1 adult, 1 teen. I can't share anything because nothing is solid yet.
Fair enough.
I always love to go back and forth between them, so I never lose the foot in the door in either genre.
Right. What about you, Kevin? Are you going to, besides taking Sebastian to Scotland, are you you're obviously going to continue with the character, but are you going to also go back and forth between literary, I can say literary, if I hate that distinction, but non-genre and genre?
I think I'm going to stick with this series for the time being, but I feel that there will come a point where I'm going to need to take a break from it and write. I have a book in mind in terms of perhaps it's more literary fiction. So for the time being, I'm sticking with this. I think there's a hint that towards the end of Two for the Tablelands is where the next book might be taking place, and there's some reference again to Scotch. So yeah, we'll see where he goes. You know, that's kind of exciting for me to see.
You're still having fun with it.
Oh yeah, I am.
I think we've just about run out of time for this half of our afternoon's programming, but I wish we had an audience here so that I could say, please give a big hand to Kevin Major and Danika Stone. Thank you both for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a blast, and best of luck with the upcoming publications of Two for the Tablelands and Fall of Night.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks very much. That wraps up the first half of our program this afternoon. So we're going to move on to the second part of our doubleheader, featuring authors Carol Rose GoldenEagle and Andrea Gunraj. I'm going to introduce both of them independently. They're going to give a short reading, and same as in the first half of the program, we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion, and all of that should take us to about 4:30. So to begin the readings, I would like to introduce Carol Rose GoldenEagle, who is a Cree Indian with roots in Sandy Bay, Saskatchewan. She is a novelist, poet, playwright, visual artist, and musician, an author of the award-winning novel Bearskin Diary from 2015 and Bone Black from 2019. Her debut poetry volume, 2018's Hiereth, was shortlisted for the 2019 Saskatchewan Book Awards. To read from her latest novel, please welcome Carol Rose GoldenEagle.
Tanse, which is the Cree way to say hello, or Kanate is Dene, and I am Cree and Dene. My roots are in northern Saskatchewan, and I like to write everything, actually. My next novel is a book of fiction, Wapawikoscikanik, The Narrows of Fear, and that's going to be released next month. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'll do a reading from that. But the other thing is, I love poetry. I love children's work. I basically just love writing. And if I didn't have to have an actual job, I would work all the time just writing. And so what I'll do is briefly describe what the next novel is about. It's a celebration of Indigenous feminism. There are so many things that Indigenous women are forbidden to do. And, you know, very, very, very few ask the question, why? Why can't I do that? Why can't I take part in that ceremony? Why can't I drum? And the response is always, well, that's the way it's always been. And that's not good enough, because honest to goodness, the Indigenous women I know across Canada are amazing. They're smart. They're accomplished, you know, they're beautiful, they're community builders. And so those are the women that I want to celebrate. So in my next novel, what I've done is I've created these 4 characters, these women who support each other. They're from anywhere age 21 to age 71, and they help each other to embrace the culture through Indigenous feminism, because we need to talk about that at this point in time. The antagonist is one of those people who tells women, you're not allowed, you're not allowed. And so I'm going to do a short reading from a part of the book where he's saying, you're not allowed. And so I'll start with this. Oh, I'm going to just turn on my timer so that I know I'm not going over. All right, here we go. So in the scene that I have written about, these 4 characters are in the backyard of Sandy, who is a character from my first novel, Bearskin Diary, and they've just had a ceremony the night before, and the antagonist, John Wayne, shows up. He's a cousin to Sandy and Charlene, and anyway, I won't give away too much, but he shows up and he's aghast. Why are you women sitting in the backyard drumming? And anyway, so the elder Nina, she says, oh, what are you doing here? And he explains to her that he's in town because in Regina, he's from northern Saskatchewan. He's there because he's going to be presenting at an education conference, which is awesome that you would have on the land programs anywhere in the province, particularly in the north, where you teach children how to do things like skin a fish and gut a fish. And he says, you know, those kids need to learn these things just as much as they need to learn math and reading. And I teach all age groups. And then John Wayne stopped short because he notices the elder Nina is still holding her drum. And then he says, but one thing I would never bring to the students is a drum like that, especially if there are girls present. A woman is never allowed to play the drum. They're not even allowed to touch it. And with that, his cousin Charlene, who's also from northern Saskatchewan, she is aghast. And she twitches her hand uncomfortably because she can't believe that he's just said that to this respected elder Nina. It's followed by a stunned silence, and the other character of Sandy gives her head a shake, and she casts her eyes down on the ground rather than continuing to look at her cousin John Wayne, and he has an expression of self-satisfaction. Meantime, the elder Nina, in her wisdom, does not act negatively. She does not react negatively at all, and she doesn't object to his comments. Instead, she holds her drum high over her head and she begins to play again, slow and methodically. And I'll leave it there, but it makes the character of John Wayne very uncomfortable, which I'm happy about. And so, as I said, it's a celebration of Indigenous women. That is what my next novel is about. There are some scenes that are very violent, and I'm not sure how it will be received, but I'm very grateful that I wrote it. So that's all I have to say right now.
Thank you so much, Carol Rose, Golden Eagle. That was incredible. Our next reader is Andrea Gunraj, who lives in Toronto and beyond writing is passionate about communications, public education, and accessible technology for social change. Andrea works for the Canadian Women's Federation, and you can learn more by visiting andreagoodraj.ca and follow Andrea Gunraj on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. She's here to read from her novel, The Lost Sister. Please welcome Andrea Gunraj.
Hello, thank you for having me, and thank you very much for that, Carol Rose. That was lovely. I am going to read just a little bit from my novel, The Lost Sister. It came out last year, 2019, by Vagrant Press, a wonderful Atlantic Canada publisher. And this book is just background. It's about a young woman who's lost her sister. And it's kind of a mystery. She doesn't know where she went, and she gets into a very interesting and unusual friendship with an older woman who's a volunteer in her community who also lost her sister. She's lost her in a different way. And they come across those lines together, and they're in North Toronto and Jane and Fitch, and their relationship helps them get through and also challenges them in this loss that they're dealing with. So in this scene, they are in the school library that Paula, the older woman who's a friend and a volunteer, works at. And Alicia and her are there, and they're having a conversation about her sister's disappearance. Her sister is named Diana. What's wrong? Paula asked. My mouth hung open. Nothing. Are you kidding? Tell me. What are the chances my sister will come back? My family carried on like it was only a matter of time. Diana's bed was made, and her clothes were folded in her drawers. My mother had brought out her winter jacket to hang out with the rest of our winter jackets, in first place in the coat closet. She hovered around Diana's bedroom as if she expected her to walk through at any moment. My father's newspaper ads had become more insistent, more convinced. Call now, cash reward, family waiting. Paula took a breath. I don't know how to answer that. Can you try? I heard my father talk with the police more than once about finding her. His voice was always solid on the phone, speaking in statements more than questions, and he often repeated the things Auntie Julie had said to him. Victim services can get children counseling and help them feel normal after something like this, yes? They were all so convinced about Diana's return that I had to believe along with them. I guess it depends on what happened, yeah, she said. What if she was abducted? Why would you think she's abducted? I don't know. Would she be able to come back from that? Alicia, I can't. Tell me. It doesn't seem very promising. My lips parted, but no words came out. No one had dared admit this reality to us. No family or friends or neighbors, not even the detective who had asked a lot of questions and spoke of procedures and forms, and it was now mostly silent. My parents and aunt only mirrored each other as they bounced down the hill in their triangle, reinforcing each other's expectations of what would happen when Diana came home. Paula shook her head. Oh, Alicia, what do I know? Anything could have happened, yeah? Maybe she's on her way home right now. Maybe she'll be there when you get back home. We thought you were abducted, Diana. How could you have done this to us? I closed my eyes and felt like I was falling. For the first time, I was tempted to speak the truth. I didn't wait or watch or search for Diana that day, I wanted to tell Paula. I don't know why I talked to that man and left him with my sister and didn't tell my parents about him. I couldn't do it, and now it's too late. Who is Ave? I asked her instead. She blinked and checked for her pendant with her fingers. My sister? Older or younger? Older. Is she alive? She nodded and turned her head to the window. She squinted when a burst of sunlight passed through the glass. Do you see her much anymore? Not so much. Why? She doesn't want me. But why? She pinched and massaged the bridge of her nose with her thumb and forefinger, making her glasses wiggle up and down on her face. It's complicated. What I wanted, what isn't complicated? I wanted Diana to come home. I wanted her to do her stretches on the living room rug, and I wanted to be on the couch behind her, both of us watching television. I wanted to feel her there. Paula and I sat in the library looking at each other. She soon eased my story aside to pick up her pen and return to her book inventory. I felt her strokes rattle over the table, the vibrations meeting my elbows and entering my bones. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And thank you, Carol Rose, and thank you both for your readings and for being here and for that incredible drumming performance, Carol Rose. You had mentioned that your book is about Indigenous feminism. And Andrea, your book as well is a very feminist text about female resilience. Both of these books are about female resilience. And I wanted to start there because in our literary culture, it still seems fabulously rare to find books about female resilience independent of a male influence or protagonist. And I wonder that, just to start things off, if I could get your impressions, each of you, about why you feel that is and what can be done to sort of privilege or emphasize stories of women supporting other women. Maybe Carol Rose, we can start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something you see often, and this is just my opinion. And the main reason is because the things that I have said in Narrows of Fear are not popular. And some people will say, oh, you're being disrespectful. And I'm thinking, no, I'm absolutely not. I think our women who go through discrimination from our own men, later on, after they attend a ceremony or something, they complain to each other, but they never say it to the man. And I don't really see where that provides any type of solution. And so I'm saying things that I've heard many women say over the years about how they were treated badly by our own indigenous men. And it's something that we need to talk about, because we, as Indigenous women, we really didn't go through the regular women's movement in the 1920s. I mean, we were still stuck on reservations, reserves in Canada. The pass system was still in place, where if you lived on a reserve, you weren't allowed to leave. And I can't believe how many Canadians don't know about that point in history. But yeah, back in 1920, First Nations people were still subjected to being, isolated on reserves. You weren't allowed to leave unless the Indian agent said you can do this. You weren't allowed to take part in ceremony at all. If I had been singing with my drum in 1920, honest to goodness, there was a criminal code. It was a violation of the criminal code. There was a law in place where I could be put in jail, or anybody, for practicing culture for 6 months. And that's why I say, in terms of the women's movement within Indigenous culture is behind, because of all those repressive policies of the Canadian government that are real. And so we need to talk about that. And in terms of now, 2020, we need to let our young women know, you are beautiful. You are so amazing. And please Do not let some guy tell you that you're not capable of something because you're a girl. I'm just tired of it. I have a daughter, and I do not want her to grow up thinking that she is somehow less. Someday I'm going to be a kokam, which is the Cree word for grandmother, and I'm going to teach both my grandchildren, my grandsons, granddaughters, that we all grow together and we grow more strongly together than apart like that. So I just had a real strong feeling that something like this needs to be said, and I said it.
Andrea, I saw you nodding along with Carol Rose. You're in agreement with what she said.
100% feel that all the ways. Thank you for expressing that. And I would only echo and support what Carol Rose said. I think one of the ways that needs to happen, this needs to be built up, is more women's voices, women's and gender diverse people's voices, and opening space for that. And I think that there are shifts happening. I see people writing about experiences and showing particularly women supporting other women, and not this idea that women are in competition all the time. Like, I think that's fine to show, but I think sometimes it kind of skews too much to that way, and we don't see as many stories of people coming across communities or within communities supporting each other. So I think actually just more voices helps do that, and being intentional about those voices, the underheard voices, the underheard stories. And I particularly loved The Break by Katharina Vermette that recently came out. And that was a great story about intergenerational support. And even with all the dynamics that were playing out in this Métis community and all the concerns and the issues, that the support was held up as something beautiful and something that needed to be, that was not like seen as a negative thing, or was not seen as something that was too insular or too, whatever the stereotypes are, right? When women just take the opportunity to support each other and don't necessarily go through mainstream systems to help each other. And I tried to do that with this book as well, too. The legal system, the police system, a lot of communities don't get support from that system. That system is not designed to support their needs necessarily, so they don't find it there. So they have to find other ways of pursuing justice and pursuing support. And many times it is these informal ways that actually need to be built up more and funded and grown. So totally hear what you're saying, Carol Rose. And speaking those unpopular things are very important these days. Yeah, for sure.
And I think they're very important in a historical context too, because as you were saying, Carol Rose, it's historically been the case that these voices and these experiences have been erased or have been silenced. And I wanted to talk about the impact of history on both your books, and the histories the sort of submerged or buried histories that you bring to life. And Andrea, I have to admit that, in terms of erasure of history, I had never heard of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children before I read this book, and I've read it now a couple of times, and I am still gobsmacked by the fact that this is a history that I knew nothing about, and I've lived my whole life in Canada. Why is it important that we resurface these histories of these things that have been sort of flown so far under our radars?
I think it's the case for a lot of particularly Black history in Canada. And the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children is a really sad and upsetting chapter in Canadian history. And I think one of the things that has been so wonderful with resurfacing those histories has been the voices of survivors of that home. So for folks who don't know about the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, this was a home that was created by a particular Black community in Nova Scotia because Black kids couldn't go into white orphanages. It was an orphanage at the time. The fact that they were putting kids in orphanages and at that time, of course, punishing poor communities and poor families and punishing racialized communities, particularly Black communities. The fact that that even had to happen in the first place, you can talk a lot about how care systems work in Canada and who gets punished and who gets harmed. And so this home was built with a very positive intention to support Black kids. But the problem was that the government which put kids into this home, did not give them the money and the support that they gave mainstream institutions and white institutions. So it was like a prison for children, and they went through a lot of hardship and pain. And the survivors actually had a legacy class action suit against the home and against the province of Nova Scotia that just recently, like last year, actually resolved with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was for that particular community. And now there's like a whole piece around it in terms of improving care systems and changing the systems. So that history is really, really important to read about. The book speaks to it in a fictionalized way, but there's a lot of stuff out there that you can read from survivors themselves, and I would really recommend that people do to learn more about it. And I think that really survivor voices, building that out is very important. And this book is particularly, the character of Paula is based on my friend's experience. He was there in the 1940s, and he shared his story with me, and he asked me to please find a way to speak about it in fiction. And I had the privilege and honor to do that with his story as part of the fictionalized process. So I think it's just one example of a lot of examples of what has to be out there to resurface these histories in lots of different ways. This is a fiction account, but there are nonfiction accounts to also pay close attention to, and survivors are leading the way here.
And as well with you, Carol Rose, you think you know the story of the residential schools, but it was only, I think, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 that, again, I learned, as someone who's lived my entire life in this country, that the last residential school in Canada closed in the late 1970s, which I found absolutely appalling. I believe it was the late 1970s. Am I wrong with that? Is it even later than that?
Later than that.
Later than that, even. The 90s, maybe.
Or 90s, yeah.
How has this history been so untalked about?
Well, I mean, history is written by the person who writes it, right? And I love what's happening right now in publishing in Canada, that we do have these diverse voices, because honestly, what you or I have written would not have been published in the 1970s. There's absolutely no way. And so I'm really encouraged about that we are moving forward. I often hear all these people lamenting that nothing's changed. No, a lot has changed. And in fact, we are talking about atrocities that have happened in Canadian history with respect to Indigenous people, but all sorts of people were treated badly by the Canadian government or their provincial governments in the past. And so, yeah, we're acknowledging that, the form, the basis of racism and discrimination stems from there, and it's passed down from generation to generation to generation. And what I'm really encouraged about now is that with someone like me being able to write what I do, young people are going to be able to say, okay, and I'm talking about First Nations, Métis, Inuit young people saying, you know what, I'm not apologizing for anything that I have done in terms of mistakes. Like maybe I haven't finished grade 12, and the reason is because I, as a student, faced discrimination in school. I think we really need to talk about these things, because we need to acknowledge that there was a problem. And once you acknowledge there's a problem, there are ways to find solutions. The one thing I do have to say is we have talked about these problems for a very long time. As you know, my background is in journalism, and I remember when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples came out.
Right.
When was that? 25 years ago, 20 years ago? It's a report basically sitting on a shelf somewhere in Ottawa. Then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out not that long ago. And that was a huge, very important process. And again, I can't see any movement that's gone forward since that important work has been done. So I'm glad that we're talking about this, because the young people who are behind us are going to be able to say, okay, you know what, it's out now, and I'm going to push forward. And they push forward in ways that are positive. They'll go to university and get a law degree. They'll go to school and get an education degree, so that they're teaching children about history in a different way than I was taught when I was a kid. Because honest to goodness, I was one of those scoop kids, and the way my own people were depicted in school, right from grade 1 to 12, was so shameful for me. I was ashamed of my beautiful brown skin. Can you imagine? And anyway, so I'm a little encouraged that slowly those things are changing, and that's good. You know, change doesn't happen like that. That's just the way it is.
Do you find encouragement from the Black Lives Matter protests that have erupted following the George Floyd murder in the United States? And is there any connection with the protests that happened after the almost simultaneous Colton Boushie and Tina Fontaine verdicts here in Canada a couple of years ago? One of the things that cheered me in both cases was that you saw not just Blacks and Indigenous people protesting, but you saw a good number of whites as well. Do you feel that the message is starting to get out there? Do you feel that these anti-racist messages are starting to get more penetration than they have in the past?
I do, and you're absolutely right. With the protests, everybody was there. It wasn't just Indigenous people or Black people in terms of Black Lives Matters. What I'm also encouraged about recently here in Saskatchewan is young Tristan DeRoche from northern Saskatchewan he starved himself for over a month trying to bring awareness to suicide prevention in Saskatchewan, because the north is terrible. The youth up there, it's an absolute crisis. And the provincial government here, the Sask Party in Saskatchewan, voted down a private members bill, which basically said, you know what, we need a strategy to talk about how we can prevent Indigenous youth up north, particularly, from taking their lives. What's happening? And I'll only bring this up as an example. When I was a journalist, when I moved back to Saskatchewan and I was at CBC, there was a story that I covered. A youth in Melfort had committed suicide, and all the media converged. Everybody in Regina and Saskatoon, mainstream media, were there, and there were counselors, grief counselors, and all. Huge outcry and call for change in the community. And anyway, I mentioned to my producer at that time, you know what? Up in northern Saskatchewan, it's an absolute crisis, and we don't even talk about it here in the newsroom. And I was not popular, but I have never been popular, and that's no. We need to work together, and I'm not just saying Indigenous men and women. I mean everybody. Sure. And so I'm glad that we're writing what we write, because, like I said, it may not be popular, but sometimes it just needs.
Andrea, do you feel that we're on the precipice of real change at this point, or?
You know, I want to be as hopeful as possible around that. And one of the things that I think we have to recognize that gives me a bit of pause is that I know that people have been talking about these things for forever, right? Like I've been doing anti-oppression and diversity and inclusion and equity work for 20 years. Carol Rose, you've been at it for a long time too. And it's not really like a kind of a moment that everything culminates to and then everything switches. As you were saying, it's slow, and you take backward steps and you take forward steps. And I think that right now we have a lot of performative stuff happening, and people are like, you know, saying some of the right things and putting their phones, using their phones to do social media activism. And whether that switches and becomes actually systemic change, that will remain to be seen, and that will take time. And I totally agree. I think we're seeing lots more communities coming together, but I also feel like there's more of a role for communities of color who are not always on the front lines when it comes to these struggles. So I think about my community. My community is Indo-Caribbean. And I know for a lot of Asian communities, of all kinds of Asian communities, there needs to be more voice from our communities to support Black lives and Indigenous lives, like straight up. We need to be there supporting people, because there's a lot of of ways that we are complicit on this land, and we are complicit in the way the systems are. The systems are not set up for us, but boy, sometimes we maintain them. So I would like to just continue saying that as much as possible, and recognizing that our destinies are tied together. And many times it's been on the front lines, people who have been fighting for rights have been Indigenous and Black communities, especially in Canada. You've seen that voice. They've been making change and we've benefited from it. So I think we have to look at how our destinies are tied up and push for that, working together a little bit more, and not just look to, I think, mainstream folks, white folks, to only join us. I think there's lots of communities of colors that have to join in with this project. And I think that's why I was really intentional about that in The Lost Sister, right. Trying to make sure I represented that there are connections that need to be made and can be made. And we do it in fiction and we do it in real life too.
Okay, I want to also add to that, because I love what you said. I really also think that the whole role of women and the strength of women is something really beautiful that's happening right now, because women are the builders of community. You don't hear about them in the mainstream media, but you hear about the men who are, politicians, but it is the women who are the backbone of every community. Doesn't matter what ethnicity it is. And I'm just really happy that we're finally stepping up together collectively and saying, you know what, we are going to make this a better place for our children. And that's beautiful. It's not just that we're out there talking and trying to bring up some sort of scenario that's a problem. We're actually finding solutions and we're doing it together. And it's a really encouraging time that way.
Unfortunately, one of the things that is proven to be completely intransigent when it comes to history and the depredations of history is the treatment of women as involving sexual assault, sexual violence, both domestic and otherwise, and at the hands of North American judicial systems. We had the Giangameshi trial, we had the Me Too movement, we've had Harvey Weinstein, and yet still, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. These things still persist. And there should possibly be a content warning for this part of our discussion, because it's a very raw subject. And Carol, I noticed that your book does come with a content warning, contains scenes of sexual, physical, and psychological violence. And in particular, there are 2 rape scenes in the book that I found as a male reader very difficult to read. And I wanted to ask you both, because sexual violence underpins both of your work. I wanted to ask you why you decided to treat these scenes the way you did, the material the way you did. And Carol, I guess we can start with you. What is the advantage in your fiction of treating this stuff on the page and being very upfront and very explicit about it in its treatment?
It happens. It's been happening, I don't know how long, probably since, Columbus landed in North America, that our Indigenous women have been sexually assaulted. Nobody talks about it. So we are doing that now. And with the one scene, and I know what you're talking about, what I really wanted to bring to it, other than the fact that it was violent and horrible, was the tenderness of piecing back together some sort of trust in humanity. Right. And it was the women who did that. The second scene, there are more than 2 scenes, and so that
I'm thinking of the 2 with John Wayne in particular.
Yeah, well, it's always John Wayne.
Yeah.
He's the perpetrator here. Yeah, he did that. The one scene that is really offensive to some people, when he's caught in the hotel, and I won't say much more than that, was necessary because as I mentioned in my preamble, he's one of those guys who holds himself out as being a spiritual man, because he runs a sweat lodge, and he's always talking, when he's talking to people about the role of women and how sacred we are, and what you want, and I don't mean any disrespect, but what you want to hear as a white person. He's Sure. saying those things, and he's doing something totally opposite in his personal life because he thinks he'll get away with it because nobody's watching. That was the whole point. And I wanted to bring those spiritual elements in there because God is watching. Ancestors are watching. Spirits are watching. You can't do stuff like that without somehow being called to task later on. And I wanted to make that point that anybody out there, particularly men, who are abusing women in any way, you're going to be found out at some point. And I'm not just talking about Indigenous men. I've read stories in the news about, doctors recently who have been accused of or convicted of harming patients or teachers or priests. So it's not just in our culture, but storyline in my culture was, I thought it was necessary to bring forward because we don't talk about that. Our culture has so long said, no one's going to believe you. Just be quiet. Something like that happens to you, don't say anything because you're going to rock the boat. Well, it's time for that boat to be rocked.
Right. And Andrea, sort of the same question, although you treat the scenes in your book a little bit differently. You almost come at the material the way a Greek tragedian would, in terms of keeping the scenes themselves off. I mean, it's very clear what happens between the farmhand and Ave, but you choose not to dramatize those scenes. Why did you make that choice, and how important is it for this material to be talked about frankly in fiction?
That's a great question. I didn't particularly do it all that intentionally, and then afterwards I thought about, why was I a little soft about it? And one of the things that I think is really important, as much as dramatizing things and being very clear about their impacts on people, I think that's one approach, and I think another approach is also to respect the survivors' telling of it. So these are first-person accounts, right? And some survivors of violence will lay it out and just tell you fully. Others will choose not to and say, I don't want to talk about that part. I want to talk about this part. I want to talk about the aftermath. I want to talk about how I healed. I want to talk about how I'm struggling now, or whatever the case may be. So I think that diversity of telling is really important. And it felt like in this story with these first-person accounts, people would speak less about the particulars of a violent situation and more about how it affected them, how they dealt with it, what they thought about it after, how it might have framed things in their lives after or not, and how they dealt with it in their own unique ways. So that was just a choice in this particular book. And I didn't, I'm not sure that I did it that intentionally, but I do think it's in the tradition of a book. Madeleine Thien did a book called Dogs at the Perimeter, and she had a scene where the first person account is saying, I went through this awful thing and there are no words to describe it. And she moves on and she talks about, other things. Right. And I thought that was so brilliant because she was choosing at that moment to tell what she experienced in her own way. And her own way was like, yeah, I know this is fiction. Yeah, I know you expect all the details, but I'm going to choose to say it the way that I want to. And it felt like a moment of people having control where they have not been in control in that situation. And I loved it so much. I just thought it was a unique choice. So I claim that I did that in this case. I don't think I did it that intentionally, but I'll claim it because I thought it was brilliant and I thought it was just another way of doing it. No right or wrong. I just think it's another way of doing it.
We have less.
I'm just going to add if I can. But I love what you say, Andrea. And what I also love is the courage of women, because these things happen in real life. And yes. So somehow it allows for a courage to say, I can speak up because somebody will believe me. And if it's not the judicial system, it'll be a group of women who are going to help me through this. So I think it's kind of a source of strength to be able to say, this happened. And I know you'll believe me. So
we have less than 2 minutes to go. So I don't want to end on such a downbeat note. I just wanted to get you very quickly both. Is fiction capable of helping in the process of healing historical wounds? In 30 seconds or less, Andrea.
Yes, but it can't alone do it. I think there actually has to be real life change that people experience, and art and life go together.
And Carol Rose?
All right. Well, I'll say yes as well because I have to. One of my favorite books is The Alchemist, and you're searching for something somewhere else. I love that what we're both writing about is what we have is here. It's always been there. And so take care of that. And that's why, yes, art as fiction or fiction as art or however you want to say it, I think it works.
We're out of time. I want to say thank you to both of you for your books and for this conversation, which has been my privilege to moderate. Carol Rose GoldenEagle, author of The Narrows of Fear, and Andrea Gunraj, author of The Lost Sister. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, Carol, Rose, Andrea, Kevin, and Danika for sharing your work with us, and to Stephen for moderating this fascinating discussion. And I also want to thank our friends at the Word on the Street Halifax, Lethbridge, and Saskatoon for their support putting this event together. Another thank you to everyone for tuning in from home. If you'd like to order copies of the featured books today, Two for the Tablelands by Kevin Major, Fall of Night by Danika Stone, The Narrows of Fear by Carol Rose GoldenEagle, or The Lost Sister by Andrea Gunraj, please head over to the Another Story bookstore website or your local bookstore. And you can join us back here on the Word on the Street YouTube channel tomorrow for a conversation with playwright Serena Parmar, or on Tuesday for our celebration of the 2020 Trillium Fiction Awards with CBC's Ali Hassan. And of course, don't forget to register for WOTS 2020, our first ever virtual festival of storytelling, ideas, and imagination, streaming live next weekend. To support The Word on the Street and other events like this one, please visit thewordonthestreet.ca and click the donate button. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.